Hey everyone, welcome back and thank you for being here. This is the second video on Kant's grounding for the metaphysics of morals. And in this video, we're going to be covering the first section, which I think is only 10 pages. And then I don't know how many pages from the introduction. It might also be 10 pages. The introduction is also, it might be 8, but I think the introduction it's 9. I think it's helpful, but I didn't want to start with it necessarily because, um, I mean, in a way, I gave you an overview that was similar to an introduction, and then we're going to read the primary source itself. And prefer that we stick to the primary sources as much as possible, um, since they're the actuality of what's tested. And sorry, let's share this. They're the actuality of what's tested and the only kind of common ground we have. The reason that I can faithfully grade it is because I understand what the texts say, and your task is to do that as well. Anyway, um, we can still hit the introduction afterwards. So in the first section, we already did the guiding questions in the previous video, but I want to just prime us with them again. What is a good will? The only thing good in itself, and it's the will to do what is right without any kind of payoff or consequence or any kind of knowledge or intelligibility about the outcome of an action or a desire. Not a desire, because a desire is something that has to be fulfilled or is fulfilled at some point. A good will, on the other hand, is never fulfilled. What it does instead, um, is that a good will enacts duty, true duty that has worth, which produces respect for the law, including respect for what you deserve and your natural rights are, because everybody deserves that. But you can only respect the law as such. You can't really respect yourself or anybody else. You can respect other people insofar as they are adherents to and representatives of the law. Um, which shouldn't be taken in a paternalistic way either. Like, it's super easy to misread this and think it's an excuse to abuse people. It's not. Um, People do demean what they deserve whenever they act in such a way. Basically, this is one of the consequences. It's not so obvious about the categorical imperative, but um, you should always act as if the maxim of your act um, could become a universal law, meaning the principle or the essence of the thing you do could become what the essence of what everybody does in similar situations. But what's not obvious is that you set your own standards. So in some ways, Kant will say that somebody who intentionally and willfully murders um, has set down a universal law that it is okay for themselves to be treated in the same way. So every action not only um, it's not even just that this is a theoretical um, guide to figuring out what you should be doing, where should is optional. But in a sense, if this is metaphysically true, then what you do sets standards. Sartre says this as well. In Existentialism is a Humanism, which I think will be assigned in my 2305 meaning of life class if I get to teach that. No, 2310 meaning of life. 2305 is contemporary ethical issues. Both of them are possibilities for the spring for me or some other semester. So just look out for those and hopefully I get to. Anyway, um, we do read Sketch for a Theory of the Emotion, so we read Sartre. Existentialism is a Humanism is a short text where he talks obviously about existentialism, kind of sets forth what it is. One of the things he says is that the existentialist, while freed from essences, still determines what their universal standards are because every act they take is an act of legislation. So they're universal legislators. Um, anyway, kind of off topic from Kant. Not really, but we have a lot to read. Um, so yeah, respect. Well, respect for the law. Um, it's again not the written law. The written law is not the law. The law of reason cannot be translated into or codified. You can attempt to, you can try to. There are certain general contours you can stand by. Don't kill, don't kill, don't steal, don't murder. So kill and murder. Cheat, don't lie. I'm sure there are some that I'm forgetting, and people are like, "Why aren't you saying those?" I don't know. My bad. Um, don't dominate people, don't manipulate them, don't try to use people as means. Always treat them as an end in themselves. Sorry, not sure why I got off. I think I got off topic there. Um, right. You can't codify the law. There are general contours. So what do you respect? And the other thing is that you can't respect, if you know that you can respect the law, but it's a priori, so you don't have access to the outside world. What kind of law can you know about or respect? And Kant says law is such, so universalizability, and that's how you get to the categorical imperative, the first instance of it, to where everything that I do from the first person perspective should be universalizable. And then the second version of it is that what I do that's universalizable, not just from my perspective, is also universal already out there in third person in nature slash God. Three, the end in itself perspective. I would never want to be treated as just a means or manipulated like that or abused. So I should never treat anybody else like that. Four, everybody should do that. So we have a kingdom of ends where everybody is doing the right thing pretty much all the time. Um, and respecting everybody thoroughly and respecting the law as such. And then the autonomy of universal reason. This has to do with the fact that all of our reasons would go through these processes independently of each other, but assent to them, meaning agree with it, like say that think that makes sense upon perception, upon hearing it. Assent is like mental consent. So it's a sort of, it's almost like a wall you let down. You're like, okay, I trust that. But the autonomy aspect, reason is autonomous because it is self-determining. And in self-determining its submission to the law, it's a weird kind of twist. In self-determining its submission to the law, it finds freedom in like mutual kind of, it's almost social contract, but it's not. It's deontological, meaning duty-based, law-based, universalizable based. Um, and this is pretty much the foundation of the rule of law, meaning that every person, no matter if you're in a government function or not, should be um, held to the same standards. Like, should have to follow the laws, basically. Caesar should have to follow the rules of Rome. This has notably been absent from the United States of America in the last few years, ever since the Supreme Court. I mean, seriously, kangaroo at this point. It's like ridiculous. Um, gave Trump presidential immunity, and I guess all presidents, but Yeah, from what I've read, they'll probably rescind that. They're using the shadow docket so that they don't have to give consistent formal opinions. And then whenever it suits them on a different partisan line, they can rescind the powers as if, and then also still not explain why they were ever allowed for a certain president in the first place. It's really ridiculous. It's super inconsistent. There's no principles at play. It's not Kantian, it's not deontological. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Um, but yeah, the categorical imperative as a human intuition of reason, of practical moral reason, suggests that everyone should have to follow the same rules. Um, and that the rules should be applied consistently. This is why Socrates does not bring his family to his death trial. He said, I could have persuaded you by bringing my wife and my kids. Lots of people do this, but I knew that your function as a jury, 501 jurors, was to, or is to, he says is, but it was, is to administrate the law, which should be, even for Socrates, should be a universal, consistent, rational thing. Whatever. I mean, how do you respect a government that doesn't like respect itself, doesn't respect the law? How does money have any value? How does labor have any value? How does people's word have any integrity? It's foolish. It's just plain foolish. So let's look at the text and see how Kant presents all these ideas. Um, First section, transition from the ordinary rational knowledge of morality to the philosophical. There is no possibility of thinking of anything at all in the world, or even out of it, which can be regarded as good without qualification, except a good will. Intelligence, wit, judgment, and whatever talents of the mind one might want to name are doubtless in many respects good and desirable, as are such qualities of temperament as courage, resolution, perseverance, but they can also become extremely bad and harmful if the will, which is to make use of these gifts of nature and which in its special constitution is called character, is not good. The same holds with gifts of fortune, power, riches, honor, even health. And that complete well-being and contentment with one's condition, which is called happiness, make for pride and often hereby even arrogance, unless there is a good will to correct their influence on the mind, and herewith also to rectify the whole principle of action, and make it universally conformable to its end. The sight of a being who is not graced by any touch of a pure and good will, but who yet enjoys an uninterrupted prosperity, can never delight a rational and impartial spectator. Thus, a good will seems to constitute the indispensable condition of being even worthy of happiness. Some qualities are even conducive to this good will itself and can facilitate its work. Nevertheless, they have no intrinsic, unconditional worth, but they always presuppose, rather, a good will, which restricts the high esteem in which they are otherwise rightly held, and does not permit them to be regarded as absolutely good. Moderation in emotions and passions, self-control and calm deliberation are not only good in many respects, but even seem to constitute part of the intrinsic worth of a person. But they are far from being rightly called good without qualification, however unconditionally they were commended by the ancients. For without the principles of a good will, they can become extremely bad. The coolness of a villain makes him not only much more dangerous, but also immediately more abominable in our eyes than he would have been regarded by us without it. Um, just gonna mention here that reports came out that Peter Thiel advised Elon Musk not to donate any of his money to charity. Second or third wealthiest billionaire, deeply into weird posthumanism, advising the richest billionaire in the world to screw all of us. I mean, a good will is good, not because of what it affects or accomplishes, nor because of its fitness to attain some proposed end. It is good only through its willing, i.e., it is good in itself. When it is considered in itself, then it is to be esteemed very much higher than anything which it might ever bring about merely in order to favor some inclination, or even the sum total of all inclinations. Um, there's a word in this next sentence which is, um, I don't think it's the same spelling as the N word, but it's an old unused word these days for like stingy, and it's in the original text. So, um, there's no like racial component to it. It just sounds really similar to, um, what does have what is racial slur, or is also a word used by a community that I'm not a part of. Um, but yeah, I just wanted to like preface that in case there's any mishearing in the next sentence. I'll explain what um, it's pronounced it's spelled Niggardly, and it's followed by provision of stepmotherly nature. And Kant's using that phrase to describe, um, a hypothetical situation in which the metaphysical fate of nature or state of reality is such that we always fail. Kind of what we talked about at the beginning, or in the first meditation in Descartes, where maybe I'm made in such a way as to go wrong all the time. Um, Kant's point will be that having a good will is enough. It's still like the crown jewel of consciousness. He says something like that. Um, so yeah, I'm going to keep reading that sentence, but just wanted to, um, I don't know, cover my bases, preface that. So even if by some especially unfortunate fate or by the niggardly provision of stepmotherly nature, this will should be wholly lacking. And I I'm gonna just look up to make sure it doesn't have any kind of, I wouldn't assume that it's in the philosophy text if it has any kind of history. Um, so it's etymologically unrelated. I was concerned not that it came from the same root word, but that it was like a derivation of some stereotype against a group of citizens, of humans. So yeah. So it's from Scandinavian. Um, but it does like it repeatedly says that it's like uncomfortable to have in writing. So I wish the translators would move past it at some point. It just means stingy or uh like Scrooge, miserly. Um, we're gonna move on. Um, so even if that was the metaphysical case, this in that metaphysical case, this will should be wholly lacking in the power to accomplish its purpose. If with the greatest effort it should yet achieve nothing, and only the good will should remain, not to be sure as a mere wish, but as the summoning of all the means in our power, yet would it like a jewel still shine by its own light, as something which has its full value in itself. Its usefulness or fruitlessness can neither augment nor diminish this value. Its usefulness would be, as it were, only the setting, which is why I said it's like a crown jewel, because it's like I think he means like when you set a gem into a crown, like the setting to enable us to handle it in ordinary dealings or to attract it to the attention of those who are not yet experts, but not to recommend it to real experts or to determine its value. So it can be like context still, or placing. Um, the other reason I wanted to spend so much time explaining that word instead of just like reading past it is because I expect some of my students to be reading this text on their own even before they listen to it with me. And so since it's assigned, I just wanted to address it instead of skimming over it. I always like to address things instead of ignoring them. Okay. But there is something so strange in this idea of the absolute value of a mere will, in which no account is taken of any useful results, that in spite of all the agreement received, even from ordinary reason, yet there must arise the suspicion that such an idea may perhaps have as its hidden basis, merely some high-flown fancy, and that we may have misunderstood the purpose of nature in assigning to reason the governing of our will. Therefore, this idea will be examined from this point of view. This is where he'll talk about happiness and the purpose of reason and misology, and how the purpose of reason is to cultivate a good will, it's not to cultivate happiness. In the natural constitution of an organized being, i.e., one suitably adapted to the purpose of life, let us take as a principle that in such a being no organ is to be found for any end unless it be the most fit and the best adapted for that end. So he's still teleological, meaning assuming that there's some intrinsic essence or purpose by design that you can infer from, again, the design or the perception of something. Uh, there are sometimes just kind of neutral things like vestigial organs. In fact, vestigial organs are a great example here because he says there are no vestigial organs in this sentence. Um, anyway. Now, if that being's preservation, welfare, or in a word, its happiness, were the real end of nature in the case of a being having reason and will, then nature would have hit upon a very poor arrangement in having the reason of the creature carry out this purpose. For all the actions which such a creature has to perform with this purpose in view, and the whole rule of his conduct would have been prescribed much more exactly by instinct. And the purpose in question could have been attained much more certainly by instinct than it ever can be by reason for like happiness and preservation and well-being. And if in addition to reason had been imparted to this favored creature, then it would have had to serve him only to contemplate the happy constitution of his nature, to admire that nature, to rejoice in it, and to feel grateful to the cause that bestowed it. But reason would not have served him to subject his faculty of desire to its weak and delusive guidance, nor would it have served him to meddle incompetently with the purpose of nature. In a word, nature would have taken care that reason did not strike out into a practical use, nor presume with its weak insight to think out for itself a plan for happiness and the means for attaining it. Nature would have taken upon herself not only the choice of ends, but also that of the means, and would with wise foresight have entrusted both to instinct alone. So if basically his argument, which I don't think I agree with, is that if happiness was the purpose of life, then instinct is more reasonable for it to be the purpose, or instinct is more reasonable as the means to that. And since we use reason instead of instinct for happiness, or yeah, and we can't just always pursue instinct, and even if we did, we still wouldn't get to happiness because the faculty of instinct is not as sufficiently made as nature would have made it for us. Then, because we use reason for happiness, or because we cannot adequately use instinct for happiness, happiness must not be the end goal. And then in a weird way, he goes back on it, and it feels like because happiness must not be the end goal, then it must not be the point of reason either. Not really sure that I like his fluidity there. I don't know. It's kind of intuitive, kind of not. But again, we have like counterexamples. We have vestigial organs. Um, and teleology is generally disproven by evolution because things change randomly, and then the things that don't do well die. This mutations, genetic mutations, and there's actually divergent and convergent evolution where morphological features on the bodies can look similar but come from different sources or can come from the same common ancestor. I think it's convergent when they come from different sources and divergent whenever they have the shared ancestor. But convergent evolutions adapt the same problems in similar ways, but the genetic history is different. Um, and again, adaptations generally are mutations that are happenstance and like they happen to be helpful. They happen to help the species survive and outperform and outcompete the other species. Um, And so even if like the non-adapted, non-mutated version was doing fine in the ecosystem, the mutated version can still come in and wipe them out. But anyway, it's The Time Machine by I think H.G. Wells is a really good look at how evolution is not necessarily always for human benefit, which is what Kant thought with enlightenment. The answer to the question was enlightenment. And he's writing, in his defense, 50 to 80 years, depending on this one was, I believe, Origin of Species was 1865. 1859. Darwin wasn't the first one to have this theory. I forget who was. But yeah, Kant's writing 75, 74 years before that. So we can't really fault him for not having the evidence from the Galapagos Islands about the different species. One example of evolution is the ring species. I learned a lot of this in my moral philosophy class, actually, um, at UHD from Dr. Tierney. Um, and yeah, like a ring species is like, I don't want to talk too much about it. I think it's a case example of whenever there's a circular like placing of a species and there's nothing in the middle of it anymore, but there used to be a common ancestor in the middle of it. Okay. So it's a connected series of neighboring populations of animals. So like I said, like a ring, and there's nothing in the middle because there has to be gaps between them. And pairs at opposite ends of the ring cannot mate or their offspring will not survive. Like they literally just won't produce offspring. And pairs in the middle are closely connected to each other can mate and can produce offspring. And so that actually even shows the point at which mutative differentiation or random genetic mutations repeated over generations of species and repeated like telephone mutations and degenerations, right? How at some point there's a full-on species change where they can't breed anymore, and where they look so different that we think that they're different. But the interbreeding seems to speak against that. And the staggered interbreeding especially seems to speak against that. Um, like if you have like 6 or 7 species, A and B can breed, B and C can breed, sorry, this is all critiquing teleology and critiquing that there is like always a best suited organ in an animal. Sometimes they just stick around for random reasons. This mutation and experimentation is also how I explain um desire in the tripartite soul. The way that wisdom and reason are produced for Plato, if you have a materialist embodied interpretation of Plato, is through failure and suffering. And so desire tries whatever directions it wants, learns from its desires. And this is also a critique of Kant because it is a way in which instinct produces intuition and reason. Um, so let's go back to trying not to critique him. And in fact, we find that the more cultivated reason devotes itself to the aim of enjoying life and happiness, the further does man get away from true contentment. Because of this, there arises in many persons, if only they are candid enough to admit it, a certain degree of misology, i.e., hatred of reason. It's the only time I've ever seen this word ever used. Misology, hatred of reason. This is especially so in the case of those who are the most experienced in the use of reason. Because after calculating all the advantages they derive, I say not from the invention of all the arts of common luxury, but even from the sciences, which in the end seem to them to be also a luxury of the understanding, they yet find that they have in fact only brought more trouble on their heads than they have gained in happiness. Therefore they come to envy rather than despise the more common run of men who are closer to the guidance of mere natural instinct, and who do not allow their reason much influence on their conduct. The pragmatists, I mean, I think philosophers, I think rational people want a balance of um, instinct and reason, or specificity and like fluidity, or precision and swiftness, right? Um, Accuracy and motion. And we must admit that because like Aristotle says you don't need like more specificity than is necessary for the conversation at hand. The pragmatists like James are concerned with stripping ideas down to their fighting weight and their cash value. If two ideas don't look any different in the world, I believe A, you believe B, but we act the same way, then A and B are actually the same thing. Just wasting our breath talking about it. But I don't necessarily think these people are disagreeing with each other when they have different ways of finding that balance. And we must admit the judgment of those who would temper or even reduce below zero the boastful eulogies on behalf of the advantages which reason is supposed to provide as regards the happiness and contentment of life is by no means morose or ungrateful to the goodness with which the world is governed. There lies at the root of such judgments rather the idea that existence has another and much more worthy purpose, for which, and not for happiness, reason is quite properly intended, and which must therefore be regarded as the supreme condition to which the private purpose of men must, for the most part, defer. Stop, Winchester. Is biting. Reason, however, is not competent enough to guide the will safely as regards its objects. And the satisfaction of all our needs, which it in part even multiplies, to this end would an implanted natural instinct have led much more certainly. But inasmuch as reason has been imparted to us as a practical faculty, i.e., as one which is to have influence on the will, its true function must be to produce a will which is not merely good as a means to some further end, but is good in itself. To produce a will good in itself, reason was absolutely necessary, inasmuch as nature, in distributing her capacities, has everywhere gone to work in a purposive manner. While such a will may not indeed be the sole and complete good, it must nevertheless be the highest good and the condition of all the rest, even of the desire for happiness. There's a way in which you could say the dialectic or the cave leads to the production of a good will. In this case, there is nothing inconsistent with the wisdom of nature, that the cultivation of reason, which is requisite for the first and unconditioned purpose, may in many ways restrict, at least in this life, may in many ways restrict the attainment of the second purpose, viz., happiness, which is always conditioned. So the unconditioned purpose of producing a good will can restrict the conditioned purpose of achieving happiness through enacting the good will. Um, so he still leaves room for like eudaimonia and happiness, um, but it's an by definition an empirical concept that is a posteriori instead of a priori, because it requires some satisfaction or culmination or partaking or sharing with a community. Still a consistent reading. We don't have to, I guess, make Aristotle and Kant disagree too much. Um, Indeed, happiness can even be reduced to less than nothing without nature's failing thereby in her purpose. Well, maybe not. Maybe we do find some contradictions in Kant and Aristotle. For reason recognizes as its highest practical function the establishment of a good will, whereby in the attainment of this end, reason is capable only of its own kind of satisfaction, not of fulfilling a purpose which is in turn determined only by reason, even though such fulfillments were often to interfere with the purposes of inclination. You know, what I want to know is is the production of a goodwill a posteriori, because it's an end. This might be like another synthetic a priori, where something is culminated or produced on a stage that is immaterial or extensionless, which implies certain things from his first book and his first critique, his first argument. I don't know. The concept of a will and estimable in itself, like I think that means like held in good esteem or respectable in itself, and good without regard to any further end must now be developed. This concept already dwells in the natural sound understanding and needs not so much to be taught as merely to be elucidated. It always holds first place in estimating the total worth of our actions and constitutes the condition of all the rest. Therefore, we shall take up the concept of duty, which includes that of a duty. Oh, sorry. Take up the concept of duty, which includes that of a goodwill, though with certain subjective restrictions and hindrances, which far from hiding a goodwill or rendering it unrecognizable, rather bring it out by contrast and make it shine forth more brightly. I hear, so this is the first case. I think this is where he starts laying out the four cases. The first one being not a duty or not good. The second being forced goodness. The third being goodness for pleasure's sake or self-interest. And the fourth final case being good against my own well-being or against my interest or without completely neutral satisfaction, very likely at some cost or exertion or effort on my behalf. I hear omit all actions already recognized as contrary to duty, even though they may be useful for this or that end. For in the case of these, the question does not arise at all as to whether they might be done from duty, since they even conflict with duty. I say four cases because in the footnote, he, I think it's him. Okay, so the massive footnote on respect is Kant, but the footnote in brackets, which is how brackets work, the footnotes in brackets about the different cases are probably from the translator, or if there's an editor, they're from the editor. They're not directly from Kant, but it's like the canon for having a shared conversation about this thing. So, again, I already went through the four cases. The second one is I also set aside those actions which are really in accordance with duty, yet to which men have no immediate inclination, but perform them because they are impelled thereto by some other inclination. So I may have said that they have no inclination. I think when he gets to the fourth case, he'll say they have an inclination, but it doesn't satisfy them, for whatever the heck that means. Because they are impelled thereto by some other inclination. For in this second case, to decide whether the action which is in accord with duty has been done from duty or from selfish purpose is easy. This difference is far from difficult to note in the third case, where the action accords with duty and the subject has, in addition, an immediate inclination to do the action. So the fourth case might be no inclination, but not impelled to, but still does it. For example, that a dealer should not overcharge an inexperienced purchaser certainly accords with duty. So don't take advantage of somebody who seems like they're going to spend too much at your shop. And where there is much commerce, the prudent merchant does not overcharge, but keeps to a fixed price for everyone in general, so that a child may buy from him just as well as everyone else may. Thus, customers are honestly served, but this is not nearly enough for making us believe that the merchant has acted this way from duty and from principles of honesty. His own advantage required him to do it, his reputation, his profit, his livelihood, etc. He cannot, however, be assumed to have, in addition, as in the third case, an immediate inclination toward his buyers, causing him, as it were, out of love, to give no one, as far as price is concerned, any advantage over another. Hence, the action was done neither from duty nor from immediate inclination, but merely for a selfish purpose. This is the third case. There are other instances of the third case, including the next paragraph, where it is like joyful for someone to be helpful. So they don't do it for profit or reputation. They just want to. On the other hand, to preserve one's life is a duty, and furthermore, everyone has also an immediate inclination to do so. But on this account, the often anxious care taken by most men for it has no intrinsic worth, and the maxim of their action has no moral content. They preserve their lives, to be sure, in accordance with duty, but not from duty. On the other hand, if adversity and hopeless sorrow have completely taken away the taste for life, if an unfortunate man strong in soul and more indignant at his fate, than despondent or dejected, wishes for death, and yet preserves his life without loving it, not from inclination or fear, but from duty, then his maxim indeed has a moral content. So that's the fourth example, but um, kind of morose to talk about. Like, he basically says, this man, this person has suffered so much they cannot enjoy anything anymore. Um, so let's look at this footnote that is right here before we move on. Four different cases have been distinguished in the two foregoing paragraphs. Case one involves those actions which are contrary to duty, lying, cheating, stealing, etc. Case two involves those which accord with duty, but for which a person perhaps has no immediate inclination, though he does have immediate uh, material, external, medium, forced inclination there too. For example, one pays his taxes not because he likes to, but in order to avoid the penalties set for delinquents. One treats his fellows well, not because he really likes them, but because he wants their votes when at some future time he runs for public office, etc. Um, I take some pause between each video that I record to try to make sure that I'm in a good energetic state. To make sure that like I come across like patient and peaceably and happy to be doing this, which I am always. It's just a lot to think about each time. But I hope you guys feel like I treat y'all well and for the right reasons. A vast number of so-called, this is still the footnote, a vast number of so-called morally good actions actually belong to this case too. They accord with duty because of self-seeking inclinations. Case 3 involves those which accord with duty and for which a person does have an immediate inclination. One does not commit suicide because all is going well with him. One does not commit adultery because he considers his wife to be the most desirable creature in the whole world, etc. But then case 4 involves those actions which accord with duty but are contrary to some immediate inclination. One does not commit suicide even when he is in dire distress. One does not commit adultery even though his wife has turned out to be an impossible shrew, etc. Now, case 4 is the crucial test case of the will's possible goodness. But Kant does not claim that one should lead his life in such a way as to encounter as many such cases as possible in order constantly to test his virtue, deliberately marry a shrew so as to be able to resist the temptation to commit adultery. Life itself forces enough such cases upon a person without his seeking them out. But when there is a conflict between duty and inclination, duty should always be followed. Case 3 makes for the easiest living and the greatest contentment, and anyone would wish that life might present him with far more of these cases than with cases 2 or 4. But one should not arrange his life in such a way as to avoid case 4 at all costs, and to seek out case 3 as much as possible, such as becoming a recluse so as to avoid the possible rough and tumble involved with frequent association with one's fellows, avoid places where one might encounter the sick and the poor so as to spare oneself the pangs of sympathy, and the need to exercise the virtue of benefiting those in distress, etc. For the purposes of philosophical analysis, Kant emphasizes case 4 as being the test case of the will's possible goodness, but he is not thereby advocating Puritanism. All right, let's go back up to what Kant is saying. To be beneficent or helpful where one can is a duty, and besides this, there are many persons who are so sympathetically constituted. This is where he talks about people that like helping people, that without any further motive of vanity or self-interest, they find an inner pleasure in spreading joy around them and can rejoice in the satisfaction of others as their own work. But I maintain that in such a case, an action of this kind, however dutiful and amiable it may be, has nevertheless no true moral worth. So consider this like the third kind of friendship in Aristotle, your friendship of character or care or virtue, and you want what is best for your friend and they want what is best for you, and you guys like, I mean, that what is that? Like that feels like goodwill. That feels like good intention. Wanting what is good for the other person for their own sake. I don't know. But then it comes into contradiction with his understanding of the duty. Because we can't take satisfaction in our wanting what's good for other people. It doesn't make any sense. And like I said, Aristotle explicitly has an argument where he says that it would be a lesser kind of happiness to not take satisfaction in something we can take satisfaction in. Whereas Kant says it's a lesser kind of, um, he's just more ascetic. Basically says we get more worth out of it by not enjoying it. It's just the exact opposite position, the exact opposite intuition. But I maintain that in such a case, an action of this kind, however dutiful and amiable it may be, has nevertheless no true moral worth. It is on a level with such actions as arise from other inclinations, e.g., the inclination for honor, which, if fortunately directed to what is in fact beneficial, and accords with duty and is thus honorable, deserves praise and encouragement, but not esteem, for its maxim or essence lacks the moral content of an action done not from inclination, but from duty. Suppose, then, the mind of this friend of mankind to be clouded over with his own sorrow so that all sympathy with the lot of others is extinguished, and suppose him still to have the power to benefit others in distress, even though he is not touched by their trouble, because he is sufficiently absorbed with his own. And now suppose that even though no inclination moves him any longer, he nevertheless tears himself from this deadly insensibility and performs the action without any inclination at all, but solely from duty. Then, for the first time, his action has genuine moral worth. Further still, if nature has put little sympathy in this or that man's heart, if, while being an honest man in other respects, he is by temperament cold and indifferent to the sufferings of others, perhaps because as regards his own suffering, he is endowed with a special gift of patience and fortitude, and expects or even requires that others should have the same. If such a man, who would truly not be nature's worst product, had not been exactly fashioned by her to be a philanthropist, would he not yet find in himself a source from which he might give himself a worth far higher than any that a good-natured temperament might have? By all means, because just here does the worth of the character come out. This worth is moral and incomparably the highest of all, viz. I'm pretty sure viz means in as such, like in regards that, or in the manner that. In other words, to introduce a gloss or an explanation, like i.e., that he is beneficent, not from inclination, but from duty. I think it means like such as or in the manner such as. To secure one's own happiness is a duty, at least indirectly. For discontent with one's condition under many pressing cares and amid unsatisfied wants might easily become a great temptation to transgress one's duties. But here also do men of themselves already have, irrespective of duty, the strongest and deepest inclination toward happiness, because just in this idea are all inclinations combined into a sum total. That's consistent with Aristotle's understanding of happiness. But the precept of happiness is often so constituted as greatly to interfere with some inclinations. And yet men cannot form any definite and certain concept of the sum of satisfaction of all inclinations that is called happiness. Hence there is no wonder that a single inclination, which is determinate both as to what it promises and as to the time within which it can be satisfied, may outweigh a fluctuating idea. And there is no wonder that a man, e.g. a gouty patient, can choose to enjoy what he likes and to suffer what he may, since by his calculation he has here at least not sacrificed the enjoyment of the present moment to some possibly groundless expectations of the good fortune that is supposed to be found in health. But even in this case, if the universal inclination to happiness did not determine his will, and if health, at least for him, did not figure as so necessary an element in his calculations, there still remains here, as in all other cases, a law, that he should promote his happiness not from inclination but from duty, and thereby for the first time does his conduct have real moral worth. It's strange too because um, in rule utilitarianism, um, John Stuart Mill basically just says that we don't necessarily need to calculate the the pleasures and pains of every action we take. We should follow just the general rules that are generally good for a stable society. Um, and he also says that what this means is that yes, we don't calculate happiness every time. We don't think about happiness every time. But when one is asked to think about happiness, they will say that it is the answer. And the funny thing is that Kant is saying, yes, but it also is the answer because it's a law. And then we have a duty to do it. So they're saying like opposite things from the same antenna. Like it's an antinomy from the same set of data, you're just taking opposing positions. Basically pursuing your well-being and your own survival and your own endeavor, like Spinoza said, is a law. It's a law of nature to want to sustain yourself. And this is happiness, this is eudaimonia, this is Aristotle, Kant, Spinoza, and Mill altogether. Yes. On eudaimonia. But then Kant puts right behind the eudaimonia, right? Says that you have to follow the duty to be eudaimonic. Viz. That he should promote his happiness not from inclination, but from duty, and thereby, for the first time, does his conduct have real moral worth. There is a pragmatic notion to trying to explore duty and respect, moral worth. Because if the moral worth can give us energy, or can be invigorating, or motivating, then it has true value. Um, Especially if we can find ways to supplement that value with the value we get from Aristotle, the value we get from Spinoza. They don't have to be mutually exclusive energies, motivations, capacities, or values, or artes, or excellences, or integrities. Undoubtedly, in this way also are to be understood those passages of Scripture which command us to love our neighbor and even our enemy. For love as an inclination cannot be commanded, but beneficence from duty, when no inclination impels us, and even when a natural and unconquerable aversion opposes such beneficence, is practical. Is practical and not pathological love. Such love resides in the will and not in the propensities of feeling, in principles of action, and not in tender sympathy. And only this practical love can be commanded. I think you need an ongoing reflexive process in tender sympathy and intuition to determine the laws um, relevant to love, well-being, and health, and eudaimonia, and the duties. So, um, the principles of action, like the science by which you empirically find the psychology and get the a posteriori data to determine specific duties, which would define the content of love as principles of action, would be developed through tender sympathy. So they're not opposed like he's suggesting. But they are still split off from the different levels of his investigation. And only this practical love can be commanded. The second proposition is this: an action done from duty has its moral worth, not in the purpose that is to be attained by it, but in the maxim according to which the action is determined. The moral worth depends therefore not on the realization of the object of the action, but merely on the principle of volition according to which, without regard to any objects of the faculty of desire, the action has been done. So the moral worth depends on the maxim, not on the outcome. From what has gone before, it is clear that the purposes which we may have in our actions, as well as their effects regarded as ends and incentives of the will, cannot give to actions any unconditioned and moral worth because it's not a priori. And if it's not a priori, then it's not unconditioned. And if it's not unconditioned, then it's not good without qualification. And if it's not good without qualification, then it's not a good will. And if it's not good without qualification and unconditioned, then it's not going to be the fourth case of duty, etc. Where then can this worth lie if it is not to be found in the will's relation to the expected effect or to the happiness? Nowhere but in the principle of the will, with no regard to the ends that can be brought about through such action. For the will stands, as it were, at a crossroads between its a priori principle, which is formal, and its a posteriori incentive, which is material. And since it must be determined by something, it must be determined by the formal principle of volition, if the action is done from duty. And in that case, every material principle is taken away from it. But if it's not done from duty, then would it often happens when not done from duty, second and third cases, the first case, that the person is looking with reference to some external condition, qualification, constraint, punishment, consequence, desire, outcome, etc. The third proposition, which follows from the other two, can be expressed thus: duty is the necessity of an action done out of respect for the law. I can indeed have an inclination for an object as the effect of my proposed action, but I can never have respect for such an object, just because it is merely an effect and is not an activity of the will. Only the activity can be respected. Well, only the intention of the activity can be respected. Similarly, I can have no respect for inclination as such, whether my own or that of another. I can at most, if my own inclination, approve of it, and if that of another, even love it, i.e., consider it to be favorable to my own advantage. Wouldn't call that love. An object of respect can only be what is connected with my will, solely as ground and never as effect. Because my will can only be in the ground, my will can never interact with the effect. Something that does not serve my inclination, but rather outweighs it, or at least excludes it from consideration when some choice is made. In other words, but there has to be something that there has to be some Kant is arguing for an ontological status of respect based on its capacity to overpower inclination and desire. In other words, only the law itself can be an object of respect and hence can be a command. And maybe he's saying that the law is what has the ontological status that commands the respect and affords the respect in response to commanding the adherence to duty. Now, an action done from duty must altogether exclude the influence of inclination and therewith every object of the will. Hence, there is nothing left which can determine the will except objectively the law and subjectively like the eidetic experience, subjectively, of pure respect for this practical law, i.e., the will can be subjectively determined by the maxim that I should follow such a law even if all my inclinations are thereby thwarted. Thus, the moral worth of an action does not lie in the effect expected from it, nor in any principle of action that needs to borrow its motive from this expected effect. For all these effects, agreeableness of one's condition, and even the furtherance of other people's happiness, could have brought about also through other causes and would not, could have been brought about also through other causes, and would not have required the will of a rational being, in which the highest and unconditioned good can alone be found. Therefore, the preeminent good, which is called moral, can consist in nothing but the representation of the law in itself, and such a representation can admittedly be found only in a rational being, not externalized outside of them. Insofar as this representation and not some expected effect, the law is the will. It's not the effect. Is the determining ground of the will. What's the ground of the will? This good is already present in the person who acts according to this representation, and such good need not be awaited merely from the effect. So at the end of that paragraph is where he talks, is a long footnote, the footnote about respect, but I want to do this short one about a maxim before. 13. A maxim is the subjective principle of volition. The objective principle, i.e., one which would serve all rational beings also subjectively, as a practical principle of reason and full control over the faculty of desire, is the practical law. So this is like the ontological status of the maxim. And the reason it's a maxim and not a law is because it's from our experience instead of from like that more considered and contemplative stage with the empirical stuff. Well, I think it's actually the move past the metaphysics. I think you need the empirical to do the metaphysics, and then the critique of pure practical reason is where you get the transcendental structures that are necessary for all of this. Cognitively. 14 about respect. Oh wait, did I finish reading that? Apparently there's Kant has another footnote that would help with the subjective principle, probably the third section. Um, it's at 420 to 421. And we're at 402, so it's very clearly not in the passage that we have excerpted. But the footnote 15 is the introduction of the grounding, or is the introduction of the categorical imperative in the grounding. So we haven't even brought up the categorical imperative, treat others how you want to be treated, golden rule, end in itself, kingdom of ends, autonomy of reason, and natural law. So the universal law is from my perspective. The natural law is from the third person perspective. Universal law is from the maxim. Natural law is from the objective principle of, what do you call it? Of volition, the practical law. I'm pretty sure. Again, I haven't studied these things, but that makes sense to me. Um, well, I've studied almost all of this. It's the stuff of, yeah, we're gonna stick with what I've been saying. Like, it's trustworthy. Um, because the formulation of the natural law, even if it doesn't coincide with the objective principle of the practical law, which it probably does, um, is the way in which duties have an ontological objective ground, where morality is objective. So it's a whole theory about the kind of justification for certain inalienable rights in political systems. I would even say that there are positive duties to shelter, food, safety, non-violence, and non-manipulation and non-coercion. Probably more. But the freedom of non-coercion is not respected enough. Um, it's probably the one we come up most against in talking about labor disputes, talking about communism and Marxism. And believe it or not, communism is the stateless society where you don't have a government, you don't have even managers, but everybody is a kingdom of ends, self-determining, doing their part. Um, it adheres to affective necessity. Anyway, when I talk about the positive duty for non-coercion, um, I assume that many people will think that communism is coercive, and it's not. State communism is. Most states are coercive, and that is a well documented, well argued insight from anti-capitalist literature. Um, right. The negative critique of everything existing is why you cannot purport what communism would be one day instead. I've probably also just described it too much already because it's not going to be any of those things. It's whatever supports life after capitalism fails. So anyway, worth mentioning that those are all consistent, that that kind of communism of justice, of each person having what they need and doing what they can. One might be a metaphysical truth at all times, given affective necessity, always doing as much as we can, and maybe there's some metaphysical grace involved. But two is very consistent with the categorical imperative and with Kantian moral philosophy. Okay. So we still haven't gotten to this next paragraph. We need to read this footnote on respect. Remember that this is where he talks about the kind of Buddhist insights that you should neither chase nor run away from desire, or fears. Desires or fears. There might be brought against me here an objection that I take refuge behind the word respect in an obscure feeling, instead of giving a clear answer to the question by means of a concept of reason. But even though respect is a feeling, meaning it's an eidetic experience, it is not one a mental experience. It is not one received through any outside influence, but is rather one that is self-produced by means of a rational concept. Hence, it is specifically different from all feelings of the first kind, which can all be reduced to inclination or fear. What I recognize immediately as a law for me, so inclination being desire, fear being running away. What I recognize immediately as a law for me, I recognize with respect. This means merely the consciousness of the subordination of my will to a law without the mediation of other influences upon my sense. The immediate, non-mediated, non-external, wholly internal feeling, eidetic, intuition, determination of the will by the law, and the consciousness thereof is called respect, which is hence regarded as the effect of the law upon the subject and not as the cause of the law. The effect of the law on the subject and not as the cause of the law. Respect is properly the representation of a worth that thwarts my self-love. Hence, respect is something that is regarded as an object of neither inclination nor fear, although it has at the same time something analogous to both. The object of respect is therefore nothing but the law. Indeed, that very law which we impose on ourselves and yet recognize as necessary in itself. As law, we are subject to it without consulting self-love. As imposed on us by ourselves, it is a consequence of our will. In the former aspect, it is analogous to fear. In the latter, to inclination. Subject to it, analogous to fear. Impose it upon ourselves like an inclination. Interesting. All respect for a person is properly only respect for the law, of honesty, etc., of which the person provides an example. Since we regard the development of our talents as a duty, we think of a man of talent as being also a kind of example of the law of becoming like him by practice, and that is what constitutes our respect for him. All so-called moral interest consists solely in our respect for the law. We can also respect isn't all on the surface. It's not all about like punctualism. Sometimes punctualism isn't the right word there, but I mean like a sort of like um externalizing of like showing off all the time. Like, because when you catch somebody who like that, who has been showing off or been like hyper, like not masking, because that's has a mental health context. But I think that like deep integrities or deep virtues or deep values that are flexible behind the surface are and that are hard earned through suffering are like more respect worthy or as respect worthy than like the high points of book knowledge. That's kind of what I'm saying. Um, so I think this is played out in examples where we gain or lose respect for somebody based on getting to know them at a deeper level and what we find at that deeper level, whether that's more than what was there before, or whether it's less than what was there before. All right, back to the main text, done with that footnote about respect. It's a really helpful footnote, really important. I think it possibly should have been in the main text. But what sort of law can that be the thought of? Which must determine the will without reference to any expected effect, so that the will can be called absolutely good without qualification. Since I have deprived the will of every impulse that might arise for it from obeying any particular law, such as the law of this country or that country. There is nothing left to serve the will as principle except the universal conformity of its actions to law as such. That what I do should be universalizable, i.e., I should never act except in such a way that I can also will that my maxim should become a universal law. Here, mere conformity to law as such, that's the first time we introduced the categorical imperative, as the translator points out for us in the footnote there. The first time Kant introduces it. And so that's the first formulation of it. If you're following the a priori argument from goodwill, you can make a pretty clear first philosophy a priori argument all the way into the categorical imperative like this. It's pretty impressive. Here, mere conformity to law as such, without having as its basis any law determining particular actions, serves the will as principle and must so serve it if duty is not to be a vain delusion and a chimerical concept. The ordinary reason of mankind in its practical judgments agrees completely with us and always has in view the aforementioned principle. So this is what I said earlier. I keep saying, this is what I said. This is what I said. Just trying to help you guys understand the primary text and get better at processing this kind of reading. But what he's saying in this sentence is that common people agree or already think of morality in this way. The ordinary reason of mankind in its practical judgments agrees completely with this. For example, take this question. When I am in distress, may I make a promise with the intention of not keeping it? I readily distinguish here the two meanings which the question may have. Whether making a false promise conforms with prudence or with duty. Doubtless the former can often be the case. Prudence is something we could have talked about in Aristotle, but did not. Indeed, I clearly see that escape from some present difficulty by means of such a promise is not enough. In addition, I must carefully consider whether from this lie there may later arise far greater inconvenience for me than from what I now try to escape. Furthermore, the consequences of my false promise are not easy to foresee. Even with all my supposed cunning, loss of confidence in me might prove to be far more disadvantageous than the misfortune which I now try to avoid. The more prudent way might be to act according to a universal maxim, and to make it a habit not to promise anything without intending to keep it. But that such a maxim is nevertheless always based on nothing but a fear of consequences becomes clear to me at once. To be truthful from duty is, however, quite different from being truthful from fear of disadvantageous consequences. So the way that it needs to be universalizable is not is that it cannot produce a self-contradiction in universalizing. In the first case, the concept of the action itself contains a law forming, while in the second, that is the duty, while in the second, or the prudence, or the fear of consequences, I must first look around elsewhere to see what are the results for me that might be connected with the action. For to deviate from the principle of duty is quite certainly bad, but to abandon my maxim of prudence can often be very advantageous for me, though to abide by it is certainly safer. The most direct and infallible way, however, to answer the question as to whether a lying promise accords with duty is to ask myself whether I would really be content if my maxim of extricating myself from difficulty by means of a false promise were to hold as a universal law for myself as well as for others. And could I really say to myself that everyone may promise falsely when he finds himself in a difficulty from which he can find no other way to extricate himself? Then I immediately become aware that I can indeed will the lie, but cannot at all will a universal law to lie. For by such a law, there would really be no promises at all, since in vain would my willing future actions be professed to other people who would not believe what I professed, or if they over hastily did believe, then they would pay me back in like coin. Therefore, my maxim would necessarily destroy itself just as soon as it was made a universal law. So there's a manifest contradiction in it. Um, because it depends on wanting people to believe it. But if they're all lying, they're not going to believe it. And even if they do, they're going to be more flimsy with their actions moving forward. Now, it goes to the other extreme, although he doesn't really consider it like he should, because if you are too strict with the law, you just get to the letter of the law, you get to dogma, you don't take into consideration exigent circumstances or diverse influences or diversity. And that's really where we find ourselves as a country right now, is on that other extreme, where we're too strict with the law and the categorical imperative. And there's a categorical imperative to say that that's a contradiction too, because we can't breathe with all these rules. Um, like people need to believe in themselves and just be able to move. Therefore, I need no far-reaching acuteness to discern what I have to do in order that my will may be morally good. Inexperienced in the course of the world, and incapable of being prepared for all its contingencies, I only ask myself whether I can also will that my maxim should become a universal law. If not, then the maxim must be rejected, not because of any disadvantage accruing to me or even to others, but because it cannot be fitting as a principle in a possible legislation of universal law. And reason exacts from me immediate respect for such legislation. Indeed, I have as yet no insight into the grounds of such respect, which the philosopher may investigate. But I at least understand that respect is an estimation of a worth that far outweighs any worth of what is recommended by inclination, right? That was his argument. He's actually being very careful with his argument. That was his argument so far for why respect must have some kind of ontological power derived from the law, which is the what has the actual ontological status and is the ground for the will. And that the necessity of acting from pure respect for the practical law is what constitutes duty, to which every other motive must give way, because duty is the condition of a will good in itself, whose worth is above all else. Thus, within the moral cognition of ordinary human reason, we have derived at its principle. To be sure, such reason does not think of this principle abstractly in its universal form, but does always have it actually in view and does use it as the standard of judgment. It would here be easy to show how ordinary reason, with this compass in hand, is well able to distinguish in every case that occurs what is good or evil, in accord with duty or contrary to duty, if we do not in the least try to teach reason anything new, but only make it attend, as Socrates did, to its own principle. So, glad I mentioned Socrates already. And thereby do we show that neither science nor philosophy is needed in order to know what one must do to be honest and good, and even wise and virtuous. Indeed, we might even have conjectured beforehand that cognizance of what every man is obligated to do, and hence also to know, would be available to every man, even the most ordinary. Yet we cannot but observe with admiration how great an advantage the power of practical judgment has over the theoretical and ordinary human understanding. In the theoretical, when ordinary reason ventures to depart from the laws of experience and the perceptions of sense, it falls into sheer inconceivabilities and self-contradictions, or at least into a chaos of uncertainty, obscurity, and instability. In the practical, however, the power of judgment first begins to show itself to advantage when ordinary understanding excludes all sensuous incentives from practical laws. Such understanding then becomes even subtle, whether in quibbling with its own conscience, or with other claims regarding what is to be called right, or whether in wanting to determine correctly for its own instruction the worth of various actions. And the most extraordinary thing is that ordinary understanding in this practical case may have just as good a hope of hitting the mark is that which any philosopher may promise himself, unlike um, theoretical or pure reason or theoretical reason um, about nature and the laws of nature. Moral reason is often right without needing to be a philosopher. Indeed, it is almost more certain in this than even a philosopher is, because he can have no principle other than what ordinary understanding has, but he may easily confuse his judgment by a multitude of foreign and irrelevant considerations, and thereby cause it to swerve from the right way. Would it not therefore be wiser in moral matters to abide by the ordinary rational judgment, or at most to bring in philosophy merely for the purpose of rendering the system of morals more complete and intelligible, and of presenting its rules in a way that is more convenient for use, especially in disputation, but not for the purpose of leading ordinary human understanding away from its happy simplicity in practical matters, and of bringing it by means of philosophy into a new path of inquiry and instruction? It's almost that we could say that the categorical imperative is a faculty like prudence or like duty or a way of a mode of enacting. Um, an eidetics, a listening. Socrates had the divine voice that spoke to him, but it was a negative methodology which told him what not to do. So if this was, you could similarly try to go about your life doing things and have the categorical imperative, quote unquote, come up and be like, no, you can't do that because if you did, everyone else would do that and you would not like that. And then when you don't hear the voice, your intuition and your prudence and your wisdom are fine. According to Socrates, kind of mixing some Aristotle and Plato in there. Innocence is indeed a glorious thing, but unfortunately, it does not keep very well and is easily led astray. Consequently, even wisdom, which consists more in doing and not doing than in knowing, which consists more in doing and in not doing than it consists in knowing, just restate that, needs science, not in order to learn from it, but in order that wisdom's precepts may gain acceptance and permanence. Man feels within himself a powerful counterweight to all the commands of duty, which are presented to him by reason, as being so preeminently worthy of respect. This counterweight consists of his needs and inclinations, whose total satisfaction is summed up under the name of happiness. Now reason irremissibly commands its precepts, without thereby promising the inclinations anything. Hence it disregards and neglects these impetuous, and at the same time so seemingly plausible claims which do not allow themselves to be suppressed by any command. Hereby arises a natural dialectic, i.e., a propensity to quibble with these strict laws of duty, to cast doubt upon their validity, or at least upon their purity and strictness, and to make them, where possible, more compatible with our wishes and inclinations. Thereby are such laws corrupted in their very foundations, and their whole dignity is destroyed, something which even ordinary practical reason cannot in the end call good. So there's a sense in which Kant might say that the way that I have been picking at my interpretation of his reading or trying to make sense of it from my embodied perspective is a way of disavowing the law. I maybe. Thus is ordinary human reason forced to go outside its sphere and take a step into the field of practical philosophy, not by any need for speculation, which never befalls such reason so long as it is content to be mere sound reason, but on practical grounds themselves. There it tries to obtain information and clear instruction regarding the source of its own principle and the correct determination of this principle in its opposition to maxims based on need and inclination, so that reason may escape from the perplexity of opposite claims and may avoid the risk of losing all genuine moral principles through the ambiguity into which it easily falls. Thus, when ordinary practical reason cultivates itself, there imperceptibly arises in it a dialectic which compels it to seek help in philosophy. The same thing happens in reason's theoretical use. In this case, just as in the other, peace will be found only in a thorough critical examination of our reason. I was reminded, maybe a little off topic, of what Plato says about the critical dialectic for truth. It's interesting that Kant uses the word dialectic as well here. Dialectic between the reason and the instinct, the reason and inclination, mind and body, or law and body, universal and particular, objective and subjective. Um, in Plato, the dialectic is something that young people do not have faith in through the critiques, but something that he reminds us we must believe in truth afterward, and truth in a process. So if you take up the dialectic where you quibble with reason and you critique Kant and you critique things and you try to reinterpret things and make it make sense, and you're doing that in good faith, then it's not the same as what he's talking about, where you're um, demeaning or denigrating or depriving or deriving or derivating or reducing or manipulating or malappropriating the law, the universal laws of reason or the natural laws of nature, metaphysics, and God. All right, guys, there's an introduction left, but we're going to do it in the next episode. It's been 91 minutes. Thanks for hanging in there and sticking with it. That is the first section. So from that, I think the other formulations of the categorical imperative are in the second section, but I don't cover them. Maybe I will. There's room in the lecture series. This is episode 2. I'll probably do introduction next, but then there would still be like episodes 4 through 9 in this lecture series uh, before, if I ever want to come back and fill those in. So if you're a student, let me know if you need anything. If you're not a student and you want to be, you probably can if you look the right places. And if you need anything, go to the appropriate authorities, obviously. But if you need something philosophically, you can leave a comment on the video. Take care of yourself and be well. Bye, guys. There's a lot of things I can't help you with, but I can, maybe explain some philosophy stuff. And I can remind you to be good people and to be careful and caring and considerate. Bye.